Beneath your feet lies a forgotten city, deliberately buried and erased from memory. Why would an entire civilization choose to hide its greatest achievements? This video uncovers the shocking reasons behind the intentional burial of ancient ruins, from sacred rituals to calculated political acts. By the end, you will understand the profound human motives that led societies to conceal their own history, reshaping everything you thought you knew about the past. We will explore why a temple like Göbekli Tepe was carefully backfilled by its creators, and what secrets the layered streets of Roman London were meant to keep. What does it say about us when the most permanent monuments are the ones we try hardest to forget? This final act of reverence, the ritual entombment of a sacred site, feels almost like a beautiful contradiction. A community comes together not to raise walls toward the heavens, but to lower them gently back into the earth. They are not destroying their temple. They are giving it a funeral. This practice was a profound form of respectful decommissioning, a sacred goodbye for a building believed to be alive with spiritual energy. Think of it not as abandonment, but as a dignified retirement for a divine residence. If a temple was the home of a god, you could not simply walk away and let it crumble. That would be an act of desecration. Instead, you returned it to the earth with the same care with which you built it. As archaeologist Dr. Elena Vance explains, to bury a temple was to give it a dignified death, returning it to the earth from which it came. This was a transformation, not an end. The structure's purpose was fulfilled, and this was the proper way to put it to rest, ensuring its sanctity was preserved forever. We see this philosophy etched into the very landscape of ancient Mesoamerica, where grand pyramids were not torn down. They were lovingly encased, layer by layer, within a larger, newer structure. The old heart of the temple was kept safe and holy, buried within the body of its successor. It makes you wonder, what does it say about a culture that honors its past by literally covering it up? This deep spiritual need to protect sacred ground stands in stark contrast to the next, far more pragmatic reason for burying the past. That profound reverence for the past could, in an instant, turn into a desperate act of protection. Picture a city, its people trembling with the news of an approaching army. Their libraries hold the wisdom of generations. Their temples contain irreplaceable sacred objects. They cannot take it all with them, and they cannot bear to see it all burned or stolen. So they make a heartbreaking choice. They decide to hide their greatest treasures not in vaults, but under the earth itself, trusting the soil to be their silent guardian. This was deliberate concealment for protection, a strategy born from pure necessity. By burying valuables, archives, or even the foundational stones of important buildings, entire communities hoped to shield their cultural heart from the looting, destruction, or forced assimilation that always followed conquerors. The famous Dead Sea Scrolls are a perfect, smaller-scale example of this. These ancient religious texts were carefully sealed inside clay jars and hidden in remote desert caves, a clear attempt to preserve a fragile heritage from a looming threat. On a much grander scale, some archaeologists theorize that certain ancient Egyptian sites, especially royal caches, were deliberately buried not just as part of a funeral rite, but to safeguard immense knowledge and wealth from the persistent, cunning tomb robbers who plagued the valley for centuries. This act of burial was not about forgetting. It was the opposite. It was about creating a perfect time capsule, a message in a bottle meant for a future generation they prayed would one day come to reclaim it. It is a haunting thought, is it not, to wonder how many of these protective caches still lie undiscovered, the hopes of their guardians forever unfulfilled. This defensive tactic, born of a desire to preserve memory, stands in stark contrast to the next motive, which was far more sinister. It sought not to save history, but to actively and permanently erase it. But the most chilling reason for burying the past was not protection, but power. A new ruler, desperate to cement their own legacy, would often see the grand monuments of their predecessors not as treasures, but as threats. Intentional burial became a calculated tool for political and ideological erasure, a way to literally bury the evidence of a rival's glory. By ordering the systematic covering of a palace, the dismantling of statues to be used as filler in new construction, or the paving over of an entire city district, a new regime could symbolically demonstrate the absolute end of an old era and the unquestioned supremacy of their new order. The Romans were absolute masters of this practice. After conquering a rival city, they would frequently build their new forums and temples directly on top of the vanquished settlement's most sacred sites. This was not just practical urban planning. It was a profound act of domination, physically and symbolically suppressing the conquered culture. The message was brutally clear for anyone who lived there and for all future generations. Your history is over, and ours has begun right here on its grave. This is historical censorship on a monumental scale, ensuring that archaeologists centuries later would find the Roman story first, while the story of the people they defeated lay crushed and fragmented beneath it. What entire histories, what languages and heroes have been permanently lost because one king or emperor wanted to be the only story ever told? This calculated, top-down destruction of memory reveals a dark side of human ambition, a willingness to shatter the past to control the future. Yet sometimes the forces that led to a city's burial were not born of human will at all, but from the slow, inexorable pressures of a changing world. Yet even the most powerful empires could be rendered helpless by the slow, grinding wheels of economic reality. A grand city built for glory can find its purpose erased not by conquest, but by a silent, creeping decay. The bustling port sees its harbor slowly choke with silt, its lifeblood of trade rerouted to a newer, more accessible coast. The taxes that once funded armies of stonemasons and architects dry up. The people, facing hunger and hardship, can no longer spare the labor to prop up monuments to a fading past. In these moments, burial is not a ritual or a strategy. It is a slow, unceremonious surrender to the elements. This is the story of economic and practical abandonment, where the upkeep of stone giants simply becomes impossible. When a society can no longer afford its own grandeur, it walks away. The magnificent structures are left standing, but utterly defenseless. Wind begins the work, carrying fine particles of dust and sand that sift through empty doorways and pile up in quiet corners. Seasonal rains wash soil down from the surrounding hills, a gentle but persistent tide of earth. In river valleys, regular floods deposit layers of rich, thick silt, slowly raising the ground level around the stubborn stone walls. In the desert, shifting dunes simply swallow entire settlements whole. This is a passive burial, a geological process that happens almost without notice, year after year, century after century. It is not an act of will, but an absence of it. The ancient city of Çatalhöyük in Turkey offers a fascinating glimpse into this gradual process. For over 1,000 years, this Neolithic settlement was continuously rebuilt. When a mud brick house became too dilapidated, its residents would often collapse the old roof, fill the interior, and build a new home directly on top of the foundation of the old one. Over generations, the entire city slowly rose on a man-made hill of its own debris, each layer entombing the one below it. This was not an intentional act of forgetting. It was simply the most practical way to live, a cycle of renewal that inadvertently created its own archaeological time capsule. This form of benign neglect stands in stark contrast to the deliberate burials we have explored. One is an active decision, a final chapter written by human hands. The other is a slow fade, a story left unfinished because the authors could no longer afford the ink. For archaeologists, this presents a profound puzzle. How do you distinguish a city that was respectfully interred from one that was merely left to die? The evidence is in the details, the careful placement of artifacts, the structural integrity of walls, and the very soil that fills the streets. But this slow, natural progression from abandonment to burial was not always so gentle. Sometimes the environment did not slowly reclaim a city. It attacked it with sudden, unimaginable violence. Sometimes the earth itself decides a city's fate. A volcano does not issue a warning. It simply wakes and the world changes in a single, terrifying day. A peaceful settlement living in the shadow of a mountain is suddenly transformed as the sky darkens and a torrent of hot ash begins to fall, entombing every home, every street, and every object in a deep, suffocating blanket. This is nature's shroud, a burial not of human design, but of pure, catastrophic force. Environmental cataclysms, from volcanic eruptions to colossal landslides or the sudden, overwhelming silt deposits of a flooded river, could bury entire cities almost instantaneously. While not intentional acts, these events often created the ultimate time capsule, sealing a single moment with a fidelity that no human ritual could ever achieve. The story of Pompeii is the most spectacular example of this. The volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius did not just bury the city, it preserved it in a state of suspended animation, capturing the final, desperate moments of its people with heartbreaking clarity. But what about the places that survived the initial disaster? Sometimes a society would look upon the aftermath and make a conscious choice. Faced with a city buried to its rooftops in mud or a sacred spring sealed by a landslide, they might see not a tragedy to be undone, but a divine sign. That layer of flood-deposited clay could be interpreted as a message from the gods, a clear instruction to abandon this place and begin again. They would not dig their old homes out of the muck. Instead, they would build their new city directly on top of the disaster layer, effectively allowing nature to do the burying for them. This was a fresh start, a new foundation laid over a sealed chapter. The old city was not destroyed, it was simply closed, its memory literally paved over by the next generation. What incredible stories are still locked away, perfectly preserved beneath the ash of a long-dormant volcano or the heavy mud of a forgotten river delta. The sheer, awesome power of nature to conceal entire civilizations leads us to a final, more subtle question. Beyond gods, kings, and disasters, what deep, psychological reasons might drive an entire society to willingly forget its own past? There is another, more unsettling reason to bury a place, one born not from reverence but from fear. We are drawn to haunted houses in stories, but what if an entire landscape was considered spiritually contaminated? For many ancient societies, a location stained by a great tragedy, a devastating plague, or the worship of a malevolent god was not just a sad memory. It was an active, dangerous presence. The only way to neutralize its power was to seal it away from the world of the living. This was the burial of a cursed or defiled site, a profound act of spiritual quarantine. Imagine a battlefield where thousands fell, their souls unrested, or a temple to a cruel, overthrown deity, its stones still humming with malevolent energy. Leaving such a place exposed was like leaving a wound open to infection. The negative spiritual force could seep out, blighting crops, causing sickness, or inviting further misfortune. By deliberately covering these locations with earth, The community was drawing a literal, physical line between a troubled past and a hopeful future. They were not just hiding a shameful or frightening memory, they were containing it. Archaeologists find evidence of this in places where ordinary garbage was not simply tossed aside, but used strategically. Broken pottery, animal bones, and everyday refuse were sometimes piled intentionally over the remains of a destroyed building, especially one linked to a traumatic event. This was not mere disposal. It was a symbolic act of defilement, using common filth to smother and neutralize a potent spiritual threat. It was a form of communal hygiene for the soul, ensuring that the darkness of that place could not leak into their daily lives. This instinct to bury what we fear or are ashamed of is not so foreign to us today. Are there not places in our own modern cities we metaphorically pave over? An abandoned asylum on the edge of town, a former industrial site known for a terrible accident, a building where a horrific crime occurred. We build a park over it, a shopping mall, or simply let the weeds grow high around its fences. We may not believe in curses in the same way, but we still understand the powerful human need to compartmentalize trauma, to draw a boundary between ourselves and a painful history. This deep-seated psychological drive to manage collective memory, to hide away what hurts or frightens us, reveals that the act of burial is often about more than stone and soil. It is about the stories we, as a culture, decide we can no longer live with. A new God demands a new landscape. When a society's deepest beliefs shift, the physical world must be remade to reflect this new spiritual truth. The old temples, once centers of community and divine connection, become dangerous monuments to a rejected faith. To simply tear them down felt risky, an act of sacrilege that might anger the very spirits being dismissed or provoke a violent backlash from those who still held to the old ways. The solution was both pragmatic and profoundly symbolic. They buried them. This was the burial of religious obsolescence, a quiet act of ideological housekeeping. By carefully backfilling a pagan shrine or a temple to a forgotten deity, the community could neutralize its power without destroying it. The sacred space was pacified, its influence sealed under layers of earth and stone. This allowed the new religious order to establish its dominance cleanly, without the constant, visible reminder of the old faith standing as a challenge to its authority. The early Christians were masters of this strategy. Across the Roman Empire, they frequently constructed their churches directly on the foundations of demolished pagan temples. The sacred spring dedicated to a local nymph would become the site of a baptistry. The stones from a temple of Jupiter would be reused to build the walls of a new cathedral. This was more than just practical recycling. It was a deliberate co-opting of spiritual geography. The message was unmistakable. The old gods are gone, and their power has been subsumed by the new. Your holy place is now our holy place, its history literally buried beneath our faith. This created a layered urban landscape, a palimpsest where each generation wrote its story over the erased text of the last. Look at the foundations of any ancient European city, and you will find this vertical archaeology of belief. A Christian cathedral sits atop a Roman temple, which itself was built over a Celtic druidic grove. Each layer represents a profound cultural shift, a moment when a society decided which parts of its past to honor, which to conceal, and which to build upon. How many of our own modern streets and towns are built upon these buried altars, the silent, submerged foundations of everything we once believed? The ground beneath Rome is not solid earth, but a compressed library of forgotten cities. Modern Romans walk meters above the marble floors of the ancient forums, which themselves were constructed over the humble huts of an Iron Age village. This is the essence of an urban palimpsest, a term borrowed from ancient manuscripts where scribes would scrape clean a used parchment and write anew, yet faint ghosts of the original text always remained visible beneath. In cities that have been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, this layered reality was often born from sheer practicality, not sacred ritual or political decree. After a devastating fire, a ruinous earthquake, or the destruction of war, the cost and labor of clearing away every last stone were immense. It was far easier, cheaper, and faster to simply level the rubble and build directly on top of the catastrophe. This was urban recycling on a grand scale, a pragmatic decision made generation after generation. Each new floor level became a fresh start, intentionally burying the past not out of fear or reverence, but for the straightforward sake of a functional present. The legendary city of Troy is perhaps the most famous example of this phenomenon, with archaeologists identifying at least 9 distinct cities built one atop the other over millennia. Each new layer represents a conscious choice to forget what came before, to prioritize survival and progress over historical preservation. The cobblestones of a bustling Istanbul street, the foundations of a London skyscraper, the subways of Paris, all of these modern marvels rest upon the compressed debris of countless yesterdays. What forgotten city centers, what entire marketplaces and neighborhoods lie directly beneath the foundations of our most famous metropolises, simply because it was easier to build up than to clear out. This slow, practical accumulation of history stands in stark contrast to the deliberate, symbolic burials we have explored, revealing a powerful truth about human civilization. Our greatest monuments are not always the ones we erect, but the ones we inadvertently create through the simple, relentless act of moving forward. A handful of earth could be the most powerful political statement ever made. When a conqueror stood amidst the smoldering ruins of a defeated capital, the ultimate act of domination was not merely to burn its palaces. It was to order his soldiers to systematically dismantle them, to carry away the sacred stones, and to bury what remained under tons of foreign soil. This was more than destruction. It was a calculated, symbolic erasure designed to prove that the old order was not just broken, but gone, physically removed from sight and memory. The ground itself became a tool of propaganda. By scattering the soil of a vanquished city and building his own forum on top, a Roman general was performing a brutal kind of magic. He was demonstrating that his power was so absolute he could rewrite the very landscape, making the past literally disappear beneath the feet of his new subjects. But this same material, humble earth, held a completely opposite meaning in the hands of a people founding a new home. For colonists setting sail for an unknown shore, the act of burial was not about erasure, but about creation. The ritual of throwing a handful of soil from their homeland into the foundation trench of their first building was a profound gesture. They were symbolically burying a piece of their origin, planting it like a seed to anchor their new community in alien land. This connected them to the chthonic powers, the gods of the underworld who governed stability, fertility, and the deep, ancient rights to a place. A foundation trench was not just a hole for a wall. It was a sacred cavity, often filled with carefully placed offerings, grain, precious objects, or even animal sacrifices, before being sealed forever under the weight of the new structure. This sealed capsule was a pact with the earth, a prayer for permanence, so the very same action, the act of burying, could mean two utterly contradictory things. For one culture, it was the final, contemptuous shovel of dirt on a rival's grave. For another, it was the first hopeful act of planting a future. What does this tell us? It reveals that soil is not just dirt. It is a medium for memory, a canvas upon which societies paint their deepest fears and highest aspirations. the ground beneath our feet is not neutral. It is a contested space, a layered archive of countless symbolic acts, each one an attempt to control the story that future generations will walk upon. This manipulation of memory through Earth leads us to a final, chilling question. What happens when this power to bury the past is turned inward, when a society decides to hide its own secrets not from an enemy, but from itself? A society can sometimes make a silent pact to forget. After a brutal civil war or the collapse of a tyrannical dynasty, the most powerful act might not be to build a new monument, but to collectively turn away from an old one. This is social amnesia, a psychological process where an entire community agrees, without ever speaking the words, to let a painful chapter of its history fade from memory. The physical burial of a place is the ultimate expression of this choice. It is not a ritual or a strategic concealment, but a slow, deliberate act of neglect, allowing the forest to reclaim a palace or the desert sands to swallow a fortress whole. The ruin becomes a metaphor for a repressed memory, a wound the collective mind has decided to seal over rather than heal. Think of a city that served as the capital for a despised ruler. After his fall, the people do not return to rebuild. They establish a new capital elsewhere, and over generations, the stories of the old seat of power are simply not told. The road that leads to it is no longer maintained. Weeds crack the paving stones, and animals make dens in the empty halls. The burial is passive, but the intention is active. It is a coping mechanism on a civilizational scale, a way to edit a traumatic event out of the official story. How do modern nations handle their own difficult historical sites? We see this in abandoned prisons, in former internment camps, in the overgrown foundations of plantations. There is often a long period of silence, a reluctance to excavate these places physically or in the public consciousness, because to do so is to confront a pain that the wider society has tried to bury. This emotional and cultural need to forget directly shapes how we discover these sites today. An archaeologist digging in such a place might find a puzzling lack of artifacts, not because it was looted, but because it was stripped of its meaning before it was abandoned. The objects of daily life were taken away, the symbols of power were defaced, and what remains is a hollow shell, a place whose story was intentionally left untold. This reveals a profound truth about human history. Sometimes the most significant ruins are not the ones filled with treasure, but the ones we tried hardest to leave empty. An archaeologist's trowel scrapes against a floor that should not be there. It is perfectly level, impeccably preserved, yet the walls that once rose around it are gone, vanished without a trace of collapse. This is the moment of truth at every dig, the fundamental question that separates a forgotten ruin from a deliberately buried secret. Was this place abandoned to the slow crush of time, or was it intentionally returned to the earth? Unraveling this mystery requires the mind of a detective, reading the subtle grammar of the soil itself. The first clue is often what is missing. A building that falls from neglect leaves a signature mess, a chaotic jumble of fallen roof tiles, toppled wall stones, and debris. But a site that was carefully backfilled by human hands tells a different story. Here, the soil layers are unnaturally uniform. The artifacts are found in peaceful repose rather than shattered chaos, and the valuable objects might still be in their rightful place, as if waiting for an owner who never returned. The discovery of China's terracotta army presents the ultimate example of clear intent. Thousands of life-sized soldiers, horses, and chariots were meticulously arranged in precise military formation within massive underground pits, and then the earth was deliberately heaped over them. This was no collapse, it was a planned, grand-scale interment, a statement of power meant to last for eternity. But not all sites are so explicit. An archaeologist must ask, does the context of a found artifact suggest a panicked flight with precious items scattered in a rush? Or does it point to a ceremonial closing with offerings placed carefully in a corner before the door was sealed forever? A single, clean layer of clay deposited suddenly across an entire city level could signal a cataclysmic flood, but it could also be the result of a massive, coordinated effort to raise the ground for a new political regime, literally paving over the old order. Misreading these clues can send the historical narrative spiraling in the wrong direction, turning a sacred tomb into a garbage dump, or a political act of erasure into a simple tragedy of natural decay. Every excavation is therefore a high-stakes reconstruction of human motives, a conversation with the past where the very earth holds the answers, if only we know how to listen. Göbekli Tepe stands as a monumental question carved in stone. Its great T-shaped pillars, arranged in mysterious circles, represent the dawn of monumental architecture, a project that would have required a staggering communal effort from hunter-gatherers. Yet the most baffling part of its story is its end. After more than 1,000 years of use, the very people who built this wonder made a conscious decision to retire it. They did not abandon it to the wind. They did not let it fall into ruin. Instead, they undertook a second, equally massive project. They gathered an enormous quantity of soil, stone, and rubble from the surrounding landscape and carefully, systematically, backfilled every corridor and enclosure, burying their own masterpiece entirely. This was a deliberate, labor-intensive act that must have held deep meaning for the entire community. The leading theory points to a ritualistic closure. After many generations, the people may have believed the temple's specific spiritual purpose had been fulfilled. Its time was over. To simply leave it exposed would be to risk its desecration or to allow its powerful, perhaps dangerous, spiritual energy to leak out into the world. By entombing it within the earth, they were not destroying it. They were returning it to the womb of the world, preserving its sanctity for all eternity. It was a gift to the gods or to their ancestors, a perfect time capsule sealed with immense respect. What profound knowledge did they believe was so complete, so potent, that it needed to be interred rather than passed on? This was not an act of forgetting, but one of supreme reverence, setting a powerful prehistoric precedent for how a society can choose to gracefully close a sacred chapter, ensuring its story would remain untouched, waiting silently for a future age to uncover its secrets. The Great Mound of Çatalhöyük is a story written in compressed earth and memory. Unlike a city planned by a king, this Neolithic settlement grew organically from the ground up, shaped by the daily rituals of its inhabitants for nearly 2,000 years. Here, burial was not a single event but a constant, intimate cycle of life. When a mud brick house became too worn or was marked by a death within its walls, the family did not abandon it. They performed a careful, methodical act of closure. The roof was taken down and the entire interior space was deliberately filled with a mixture of clean clay, soil, and the refuse of daily life. This was not mere disposal, it was a transformation. The old home, now a solid, sterile platform, became the literal and spiritual foundation for the next generation's dwelling. New walls rose directly from the footprint of the old, the past providing unwavering support for the present. This created a deeply layered community, a vertical timeline of ordinary lives stacked one upon the other. The entire settlement slowly rose over the millennia, forming the massive artificial hill or tell that we see today. How does this change our view of progress in the ancient world? At Çatalhöyük, advancement was not about clearing away the old to make room for the new. It was about integration. The community's history was not discarded but physically incorporated, a constant, tangible reminder of their ancestors just beneath their feet. This intimate, domestic form of burial, driven equally by spiritual belief and sheer practicality, stands in quiet contrast to the sudden, politically charged interment of a Roman city. It suggests a worldview where time was not a linear march but a continuous, respectful spiral. The Roman town of Venta Icenorum did not end with fire or sword. It faded with a quiet sigh. Located in what is now Caister St. Edmund in Britain, this was once a bustling administrative center, a symbol of Roman order imposed upon the landscape of the Iceni tribe. Yet when the legions left and the empire's grip weakened, something remarkable happened. The local population did not fight to preserve the stone forum or the basilica. They simply walked away from them, allowing the heart of the town to be slowly reclaimed by the earth. This was not a violent erasure, but a peaceful, deliberate forgetting. The people did not vanish. They moved their timber-framed homes and their daily lives to the edges of the old Roman grid, letting the grand public buildings at the center slowly decay. Over generations, they quarried the neatly cut stone from the amphitheater and the baths, using it for their own practical needs, for walls and foundations. The empty shells of Roman power were left to be filled with wind-blown soil and covered by the plow, transforming a forum into a farmer's field. This gradual burial was an act of profound cultural reassertion. For centuries, the Roman town had represented an alien way of life, an urban identity imposed from a distant continent. Its straight streets and stone monuments were symbols of a foreign administration, one famously resisted by the local Iceni queen, Boudica. When that power receded, the people chose to return to their own architectural traditions and their own relationship with the land. They were not destroying history. They were simply resuming it, picking up the threads of a pre-Roman culture that had been temporarily suspended. The burial of Venta Icenorum was a statement made not with weapons but with silence and weeds. It was a community collectively deciding that the grandest symbol of civilization was no longer relevant to their lives and allowing the soil to close over it like a healing wound. What does it mean when a people's greatest act of resistance is not to fight an invader, but to quietly forget everything that invader built? The sands of Sudan guard secrets of a kingdom that chose to vanish on its own terms. Far from the Nile's familiar banks, the pyramids of Meroë rise from the desert, sharp, steep silhouettes against an endless sky. These are not the tombs of Egypt, but of the kingdom of Kush, a powerful African civilization that once rivaled its northern neighbor. Yet the story of their abandonment is not one of sudden collapse, but of a dignified, calculated withdrawal. As the kingdom's influence waned and the relentless desert began to reclaim the land, the people of Kush did not flee their sacred necropolis in chaos. Instead, they performed a final, solemn ritual. The entrances to the royal tombs were meticulously sealed with stone blocks, their locations sometimes obscured, a careful and deliberate act of closure. This was not an act of panic, but one of profound royal duty. The goal was to protect the spirits of their departed kings and the magnificent grave goods that accompanied them into the afterlife, securing them for eternity against any who might disturb their rest. With the sacred work complete, the people stepped back and the environment took over. The shifting sand dunes, driven by the wind, began their slow, patient work, drifting against the pyramid bases, climbing their sides, and eventually swallowing the entire complex in a golden shroud. This was a symbiotic burial, a partnership between human intention and natural force. The Kushites intentionally closed the chapter, and the desert, like a faithful librarian, gently placed the book on a high shelf, preserving it intact for centuries. What royal lineages, what untold stories of African grandeur did those sands so faithfully guard? This graceful surrender to the elements reveals a unique philosophy. where a civilization's final act of power was not to fight the inevitable, but to orchestrate its own dignified disappearance, ensuring its legacy would sleep safely until the world was ready to listen again. The silence that fell over Mycenae was not peaceful, it was profound. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the great palace complexes of the Mycenaean world met a sudden, violent end. Fire gutted the Meroë, the great halls where kings once presided. The intricate administrative systems, the trade routes, the very structure of this sophisticated Bronze Age society shattered into fragments. What followed was not a recovery, but a descent into a historical twilight known as the Greek Dark Ages. Literacy in the Linear B script vanished entirely, a skill lost for centuries. The ruins of mighty citadels like Mycenae and Pylos were not looted for building stone or resettled by squatters. They were simply left, their broken walls staring at the sky, as the people who might have remembered their purpose scattered or turned their attention solely to survival. This was an unintentional burial, a slow interment driven not by ritual or strategy, but by catastrophic civilizational failure. The soil did not rush in, it crept. Wind blew dust into the empty throne rooms. Rain washed earth from the hillsides, gradually filling the corridors. Generations lived and died, their world shrinking, their stories narrowing to the immediate concerns of village life. The great past became a blank space. By the time classical Athens arose 1,000 years later, the Greeks had no memory of their own Bronze Age ancestors. They looked upon the colossal, unmortared cyclopean walls of these ruins and could not conceive of human hands building them. They crafted a new explanation, a myth that these fortifications were the work of a race of one-eyed giants. The physical reality of their own history was right there, yet its true meaning was utterly lost, buried under layers of earth and an even deeper layer of forgetting. How does a society misplace its own story? This is the most extreme form of historical burial, where the site is not just concealed, but its context, its language, and its very place in the human narrative are erased. The ruins remained, but they became empty shells, their grandeur speaking a language no one could any longer understand. Stone endures long after wood has returned to the earth. This simple, brutal fact of preservation dictates so much of what we know, and more importantly, what we have lost. The grandest structures were often built from the most permanent materials precisely because they were meant to last for eternity. A temple's stone pillars, a palace's fired brick walls, a king's granite tomb, these were designed to defy time itself. When such a place was intentionally buried, whether for ritual or political reasons, it was essentially placed in a perfect time capsule. The earth protected it from weathering, from scavengers, and from the destructive cycles of rebuilding. The very act of burial that was meant to erase it from memory is often the very reason we can excavate it today. But what of the ordinary world? The vast majority of people in any ancient society lived in homes of wood, with walls of wattle and daub and roofs of thatch. These materials are organic, they decay, they rot, they are delicious to insects and are easily dismantled for reuse. When a humble village was abandoned, there was no grand ceremony to fill it with earth. Its timbers were likely carted away to build a new home elsewhere. The thatch roof collapsed, the mud walls melted back into the ground with the rain. Within a few generations, all that might remain is a faint discoloration in the soil, a ghostly imprint that only the most trained eye can detect. This creates a profound and unavoidable bias in the story we tell. We find the palaces and the temples because they were built to be found, or at least to be permanent. We find the elite burial chambers filled with gold because they were sealed with stone. But the farmer's hut, the potter's workshop, the weaver's simple home, these places and the countless stories they held have largely vanished. Our understanding of the past is therefore tilted heavily toward the powerful, the wealthy, and the sacred. The silent, everyday majority, the very backbone of these civilizations, is often absent from the record. What songs did they sing? What tools did they craft? What did a typical family eat for dinner in a forgotten Bronze Age village? The materials they used for their daily lives have betrayed their memory, returning to the earth and leaving barely a whisper behind. This means that archaeology, by its very nature, is often the study of ancient one-percenters. We are piecing together history from the durable remnants of the elite, while the world built from wood and fiber has evaporated. When we marvel at a perfectly preserved stone city, we must also pause to remember the vast, invisible city of wood that almost certainly surrounded it, a bustling world of common life that is now just empty space and fertile soil. The past we can see is only a fragment, a collection of the things that were considered important enough to build from stone, and in some cases, important enough to deliberately hide from the future. The luck of geography is the silent curator of our entire understanding of the past. While we have explored the profound human reasons for burying history, we must also acknowledge nature's role as a powerful, if entirely accidental, partner in this process. Entire environments function as perfect time capsules, not through any conscious design, but through simple, relentless chemistry and climate. An arid desert does not set out to mummify a body, it just relentlessly draws every drop of moisture from the flesh. A frozen tundra does not intend to preserve a mammoth, it just never thaws. A waterlogged bog, starved of oxygen, cannot support the bacteria that would normally cause decay, so it holds onto whatever falls into its embrace for millennia. Consider the Oseberg Viking ship, a magnificent vessel that was intentionally buried in a massive clay mound in Norway as a royal tomb. The human act was the burial, a grand funeral for a powerful woman. But the miracle of its preservation was a gift from the environment. The waterlogged, dense clay created an airless seal around the ship's timber, its carvings, and its countless grave goods. In a different, well-drained soil, the wood would have rotted away to nothing within centuries. Instead, it survived for over 1,000 years, a ghost ship from the Viking Age emerging almost intact. Half a world away, in the blistering dryness of China's Taklamakan Desert, the same principle played out with the Tarim mummies. These astonishingly preserved individuals, with their intact clothing and distinct facial features, were likely buried according to their own cultural rites. But the desert air, incredibly dry and salty, acted as a natural desiccant, drawing all moisture from their bodies and halting decomposition in its tracks. The burial was intentional, but the mummification was a spectacular accident of geography. This natural preservation can freeze a moment with such perfect, poignant clarity that it feels almost intentional. It is as if the environment itself decided to press a flower between the pages of history. This raises a haunting counterpoint. For every Oseberg ship or Tarim mummy, how many other intentionally buried sites have been utterly lost to us because they rested in a tropical climate that devours wood and cloth, or in a temperate forest where acidic soil dissolves bone? A king's elaborate ship burial in the Baltic Sea might be discovered, while a pharaoh's equally elaborate funeral barge on the Nile has vanished without a trace, not because it was less significant, but because its environment was less forgiving. Our entire historical record is therefore skewed, a collection of stories not just from those who built to last, but from those who were fortunate enough to build in a place where the very earth conspired to remember. Our digital world is now the most fertile ground for a new kind of burial. We are all digital archaeologists sifting through the obsolete layers of our own recent past. An entire social network like MySpace becomes a ghost town, its millions of user profiles and custom pages vanishing into a digital void not because of a cataclysm, but simply because the platform was abandoned. The data is still there, somewhere on a forgotten server, but the cultural context to access it is gone. We have allowed the very formats of our memories to become unreadable, from floppy disks to VHS tapes, creating a digital dark age where our own history is buried in plain sight, locked behind technological obsolescence. This is not so different from a Roman building being stripped of its meaning and used as a quarry. We are quarrying our own past for parts, letting the rest be swallowed by the relentless advance of the next upgrade. On a more personal level, what happens to a social media profile when its user passes away? It becomes a digital tomb, a carefully curated memory sealed by a password, left to stand as a monument in a landscape that continues to change around it. These are our modern tells, not made of earth but of silent servers and corrupted files. And just as ancient societies paved over sacred springs, we physically build over our own contentious histories. A bronze statue of a controversial historical figure is not merely taken down. It is removed from its pedestal and often placed in storage, buried in a warehouse to neutralize its symbolic power. A street named for a segregationist is renamed, effectively erasing that legacy from the daily navigation of the city. We construct a shopping mall directly on top of a historic battlefield, prioritizing commerce over the uncomfortable truth of the ground beneath. Are these parking lots and food courts not our own version of a Roman forum built over a conquered temple? The motives are hauntingly familiar. We are attempting to manage collective memory, to draw a line between a painful past and a more palatable present. We bury what we can no longer celebrate or what we are ashamed to remember. Every time we choose to let an old website die or decide to dismantle a monument without a public conversation, we are making a conscious choice about what parts of our story will be left for the future to find. The ruins we are creating today will not be made of stone, but of silicon and steel and unresolved social tension. What will future digital excavators conclude about us when they uncover our buried servers and our empty plinths? They will see that for all our technology, our most fundamental human impulse remains the same: the need to control the narrative of who we were by deciding what we leave behind. Unearthing a place that was deliberately put to rest is an act that carries a heavy burden. If a civilization lovingly buried its temple to grant its gods eternal peace, does science have the right to disturb that slumber? This is the core of the modern ethical dilemma in archaeology. Excavation, for all its noble goals of discovery, can be perceived as a profound violation, a desecration of the final wishes of the people who sealed that space. It is the equivalent of opening a sealed tomb not out of necessity but out of curiosity, ignoring the clear intent of those who closed it for a reason. The original act of burial was a powerful statement, a final chapter. By digging it up, we are, in a very real sense, rewriting that ending to suit our own narrative. Beyond the spiritual concerns lies a very physical threat: the race against decay. A tomb or a temple can survive for thousands of years in a stable, sealed environment, protected from oxygen and fluctuations in temperature and humidity. The moment the first shovel breaks that seal, a clock starts ticking. Vibrant wall paintings can fade and flake within days. Organic materials like wood, leather, and textiles, once perfectly preserved, can crumble into dust when exposed to the air. The famous terracotta warriors of China, for instance, were originally painted in brilliant, lifelike colors that vanished almost immediately upon exposure to the dry air. In these cases, the act of discovery becomes the first step in the object's destruction. This has led many in the field to champion a principle of preservation in place. Why risk the irreversible loss of a site when technology can offer a window into its secrets without ever breaking the ground? Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scans from aircraft, and other remote sensing tools can map entire cities, revealing the outlines of streets, plazas, and buildings hidden deep beneath the earth. These methods allow us to learn, to map, and to understand, all while leaving the sacred ground undisturbed. So when is the right time to dig, and when is it more respectful to walk away? The answer is never simple. It forces a difficult balance between our insatiable human thirst for knowledge and our profound responsibility to honor the past on its own terms. Do we have the right to wake the gods a culture worked so hard to put to sleep? A laser pulse fired from a plane can see through 1,000 years of jungle growth. This is the power of LIDAR, or light detection and ranging, a technology that is fundamentally rewriting the map of human history. By stripping away the digital veil of vegetation, LIDAR surveys have revealed the ghostly footprints of vast, interconnected cities in the Guatemalan rainforest, proving the Maya civilization was far more populous and complex than we ever dreamed. This is not a slow, patient dig. It is a sudden, breathtaking revelation, as if a curtain has been pulled back on an entire lost world. But LIDAR is only one tool in a new non-invasive arsenal. Ground-penetrating radar acts like a sonar for solid Earth, sending energy pulses downward and reading the echoes that bounce back from buried walls, tombs, or even ancient roadways. It allows archaeologists to literally map a city's skeleton while its flesh of soil remains undisturbed. Then there is magnetometry, a device that reads the faintest scars of human activity. An ancient hearth, a pottery kiln, even a filled-in storage pit, all leave a subtle magnetic signature on the earth that betrays their presence to the sensitive instruments. Together, these technologies grant a form of respectful X-ray vision, turning the ground from an impenetrable mystery into a readable text. We can now conduct an entire archaeological investigation without ever lifting a shovel, preserving the sacred seal of a site while still deciphering its story. What does this mean for the future of discovery? It suggests that the greatest ruins of our planet are not all found. They are simply waiting, hidden beneath farm fields, under bustling modern cities, and deep within remote jungles for our new electronic senses to finally perceive them. The race is no longer just to dig, but to look, and in looking, to see the invisible cities all around us. A lost city, once unearthed, never leaves a culture unchanged. The very ground can shift beneath a nation's feet when a buried past is brought back into the light. This psychological impact of rediscovery can be as monumental as the ruins themselves. In the early 20th century, the excavation of the Minoan Palace at Knossos on Crete sent shockwaves through history. Before its discovery, the grand narrative of Greek heritage began with the Mycenaeans and Homeric heroes. The Minoans were a forgotten people, their story entirely erased, but the uncovering of their vibrant, sophisticated, and utterly unique civilization gave modern Greece a stunning new origin story. Here was a glorious, pre-Hellenic culture of immense artistic achievement and labyrinthine palaces, a heritage that stretched centuries further back than anyone had known. This was not just an archaeological find. It was a gift of identity, a source of immense national pride that expanded the very definition of what it meant to be Greek. The past they walked upon was suddenly deeper and richer than they had ever dreamed. Yet the opposite effect can occur when the ruins that emerge are not of palaces but of prisons. The unearthing of sites linked to profound trauma, like former concentration camps across Europe, does not bring celebratory pride. It forces a painful, necessary, and often brutal confrontation with a past that many would prefer to keep buried. These are not ruins to be celebrated, but to be mourned and remembered. They stand as undeniable evidence against denial, forcing a society to stare directly into an abyss it helped to create. This process, while agonizing, is a crucial form of historical reckoning, a public accounting for a buried horror. So rediscovery can heal old wounds by acknowledging them, or it can fuel political controversy by challenging a comfortable national myth. It can return a lost piece of a people's soul, or it can expose a foundational lie they have told themselves for generations. What happens to a country's story when a long-suppressed chapter is violently resurrected, demanding to be read? The act of unburying is never a sterile, academic exercise. It is a deeply human drama that rewrites the story we tell about ourselves, for better or for worse. The map of our ancient world is still riddled with blank spaces. For every legendary city like Petra carved into rose-red cliffs or Machu Picchu perched among Andean peaks, countless others sleep in silence. Vast, difficult-to-reach regions of our planet have barely been touched by an archaeologist's trowel. The dense, roadless canopy of the Amazon rainforest, the endless, shifting dunes of the Sahara, and the remote, mountainous expanses of Central Asia represent the final frontiers of terrestrial discovery. These are not empty lands, they are simply lands whose stories have not yet been interrupted. The very climate that protected them is now shifting, presenting both unprecedented opportunity and irreversible loss. In the high Alps, melting ice patches and retreating glaciers are surrendering treasures they have held for millennia, from perfectly preserved Otzi, the Iceman, to wooden arrows and leather goods from ancient hunters. Each melt is a race against time to recover these organic artifacts before they decompose. Yet at the same time, rising sea levels and intensifying coastal erosion are washing away the foundations of human history. Entire settlements that once thrived along ancient shorelines are now crumbling into the ocean, their stories lost to the waves forever. This paradox forces a dramatic shift in where we look. The next great lost city may not be in a deep jungle, but under deep water. The anoxic, oxygen-depleted waters of the Black Sea are a graveyard of stunningly preserved ancient shipwrecks, and some researchers believe its depths may also hide submerged Neolithic villages, flooded as the sea level rose at the end of the last ice age. The immense ice sheets covering Greenland lock away secrets of Viking settlements and perhaps even earlier cultures, waiting for technology to allow us to peer through the frozen depths. And we are no longer searching with our eyes alone. Artificial intelligence now scans millions of square miles of satellite imagery, trained to recognize the subtle, geometric signatures of human construction hidden beneath forest canopies or just under the desert sand. These algorithms can detect patterns invisible to the human eye, identifying potential sites for ground exploration at a scale and speed once unimaginable. The great age of finding is not behind us, it is accelerating. What civilization-changing metropolis, what library of forgotten knowledge, is waiting just beneath the surface of a farmer's field or the sediment of a silent sea? The Earth has not yet shown us all its hands. The deliberate burial of ancient ruins is one of humanity's most profound and multifaceted behaviors. It weaves together threads of religion and raw political power, deep psychological fears and stark practical necessity. From the sacred closure of Göbekli Tepe to the calculated erasure practiced by Roman conquerors, these acts were never mere destruction. They were decisive choices about what a culture chooses to remember and, more importantly, what it decides to forget. These buried layers teach us that history is not a simple, linear path of progress. It is a complex tapestry of creation, of preservation, and of intentional loss. Every time we uncover one of these sealed chapters, we are reminded that our own civilization is making similar choices every single day. We decide what to build up, what to tear down, and what we will leave in the ground for the future to find. The past is not a dead thing. It is merely waiting silently for us to listen. So reflect on the legacies you are creating and consider what you, in your own life, might be choosing to bury. If this journey into the hidden layers of history captivated you, subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries. We would love to hear which buried ruin fascinates you most, so please share your thoughts in the comments.